Hello BookTube, I'm Heather and this is Recently Seen Reading, and today I'd like to do a kind of quickish wrap up of the reading I did in February. I have an enormous caveat. Some of these are books that I found disappointing, not necessarily bad, but disappointing, and my interpretation of them may have been swayed by a mood that wasn't great. I had a lot of what are ultimately very trivial problems to deal with in February, and I think that influenced a lot of my reading this month. So how about I go through, say, 3 books that I found interesting but ultimately disappointing, and 3 books that I think are quite good and are the kind of book that could sustain rereading. The other 3 I'm not so sure can sustain rereading, at least not for me. I've got notes here because there's no way I can remember everything anymore. Old lady. First one, David Diop's latest novel, Beyond the Door of No Return. This was translated by Sam Taylor and was published late in English, late in 2023, but originally published in French in 2021. So this opens in the early 1800s in France, where a dying naturalist is writing a letter to his daughter, which he's then hiding in a piece of furniture that comes to her upon his death. All of this happens in the very early pages of the novel, so please don't think of it as a spoiler. So Diop is clearly having some fun playing with 18th century conventions about layered narratives and hidden manuscripts and all of that. The story that the dying naturalist, the father, is telling is an account of time he spent in Senegal among the Wolof people, learning and exploring the natural life, primarily plant life there, and becoming immersed in the Wolof language and following various story trails, shall we say, through the narrative, and becoming increasingly jaded about the realities of the slave trade. All very promising material, but ultimately I found this kind of a frustrating book. Part of it, I think, has to do with the narrative strategy that Diop is using. It's an unreliable narrator, but I found the narrator also incredibly self-congratulatory in those moments when he sees African people as fully human. There's something in it that I think maybe is intended to be satirical or slightly comic that just didn't work for me. Entirely possible that this works better in French than it does in English. Diop's last novel, At Night All Blood is Black, also had an unreliable narrator and a very propulsive outcome to that novel, and I found it much more satisfying. So I think the difference here has something to do with the subject matter and with the framing of it all in the 18th century context. That's my guess, at least. It's also entirely possible that I'm missing layers of nuance. So I found that one disappointing because I was really looking forward to something a little bit more like At Night All Blood is Black, and I didn't quite get it. The second novel I read that I found disappointing was Muriel Barbery's The Elegance of the Hedgehog. This one came out in 2006 and was later translated from the French by Alison. This one was everywhere about a decade ago, but I just picked it up last month and gave it a read. The conceit of this is that there are 2 characters whose lives are happening in parallel, and there are different life stages. So we have a concierge who is in her mid-50s, and we have a tenant who's 12 or 13, and they're both interested in similar things. They're interested in art, and they're interested in philosophy, and they both have lots of criticism and scorn for the way class and wealth works in their society. So lots of similarities, and the characters eventually do intersect as they become, briefly, I guess, friends, as you'd expect from the very opening moments of the novel. I found this actually a very flawed novel and don't quite understand why it got such a positive reception. The characters seem quite stereotyped to me. They're exactly the way you'd expect them to be presented in the critiques of French society, or exactly what you would expect going into the novel. It resolves the plot by introducing kind of magical characters. They're not actually magical, but they have that magical function by introducing very wealthy Asian characters who transform the plot. So it's kind of like the same thing you can see sometimes in US fiction, where an African or black character will be introduced at the end as the magical Negro who resolves the plot. I found this very frustrating approach from Barbery. The Asian characters are also oddly stereotyped and idealized. So I think this one's a very flawed novel, and I don't think I would recommend it for anyone to pick up, but I'm glad it's off my reading list. Let's see, the third one that I read, which was oddly, maybe not so oddly, it was a frustrating read in the end, is a bit of non-fiction, and Susan Neiman's Left Is Not Woke. This came out in late 2023, late, or in the summer, just the latter half of 2023. And I picked this up because I heard her speaking on the radio and thought her arguments were interesting, and she seemed kind of very over the top in all of her arguments, so I wanted to read the book to get a better sense of what she's actually talking about, what her actual argument is. Her basic thesis is that the principles that the left based its arguments on, or its view of the future on, originate in what she would call Enlightenment 18th century thinking, and that contemporary people who describe themselves as being on the left have betrayed those principles, and that there's very little of these Enlightenment principles evident in left-wing rhetoric that she would call woke. Okay, so she takes a lot of contemporary thinkers in theory to task for what she calls wokeism. Wokeism is a really fraught term. Everybody knows this, right? So, in critique of contemporary political thought, totally fair game. I mean, sloppy thinking, absolutely fair game to talk about it. And it can be quite an interesting thing to read, whether you're reading someone's critique of a position you support or a critique of a position you don't support. The act of working through the critique itself and thinking through it is helpful in clarifying one's own thought and illuminating what's going on around us, right? I think that this, though, is a very flawed book. Another kind of a side note, she's not well served by her copy editors. There's some howlers in the book, but the approach that she takes is fundamentally flawed, I think. And that flaw, I think, probably comes from the origin of the book. It's a very slim little book. It's 150 pages or so, and it originated in a series of lectures, and that origin clearly shows in the book. One of the things that Neiman is interested in doing, at least what she says she's interested in doing, is critiquing specific thinkers. And she does work through some critiques of Michel Foucault and Carl Schmitt's thought, but everything else is kind of alluded to but not really addressed in terms of contemporary thought. There's a lot of hand-waving over there. That person says this, without the person being named or what's being described being accurately described, or worse, quoted. There's actually a fundamental flaw in citation in this book. I counted at least 20 instances where she is quoting from specific texts which are identifiable in the paragraph, but there's no footnote. The book otherwise is footnoted, but in 150 pages to have 20 missing citations, just entirely absent, is troubling. The primary problem with that is that it really undermines her argument, because it makes it very obvious that she's not actually addressing specific texts or specific thinkers. It becomes a series of straw men that she sets up and tries to knock down. Very frustrating. When I'm reading a bit of political critique like this, what I want is not necessarily fair-mindedness, but I want the apparatus to be clear. If there are quotations, I want to be able to trace them back to their source so that I can understand whether someone's being quoted in context, so I can go and read the argument myself so I can position it correctly. And Neiman doesn't give me that. And I think that really weakens a book that she clearly intends to be a polemic, to be persuasive. I don't think it actually is very persuasive because it's missing that kind of careful argumentation. Now, do I think Neiman is capable of careful argumentation? Yes, quite clearly she is, but not in this book. I wouldn't actually recommend this one unless you want to kind of get your blood pressure up over weak forms of arguing. So disappointing. She's got interesting ideas to pursue, interesting arguments to make, but I think this one falls flat because of some straw man arguments and a very flawed approach to citing the work she's actually quoting. Okay, that's not about ranting about that. It's an unfortunate book in many ways, as well as kind of 3 disappointing or frustrating books I read in February. I also read 3 that I would recommend or would even put on a list of things potentially to reread. The first is Margaret Atwood's Cat's Eye. Now, this came out in 1988, and I will be the first person to acknowledge that I am not an Atwood fan. I stopped reading her regularly as the books were published in early 1990s, late 1880s. Partly that was because of my frustration with the way the Canadian media in particular positions Atwood as the Canadian writer, as being a quintessentially Canadian voice. She's not a quintessentially Canadian voice. She has a very, very Ontario voice. She's an Ontario writer. And so it gets under my skin when she's described as being very Canadian, as if she represents the voice of the experience of people from one side of the country to the other. And it's an irritation that comes partly from the tendency of people to talk as if Ontario is actually Eastern Canada, as if there aren't millions and millions and millions of people living east of the Ontario border. There are millions of people. And the perspectives are, of course, different. So that's one kind of potentially petty reason why I find Atwood irritating. There are all kinds of other reasons. It didn't help that in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I was working in an environment where there were people who were professionally connected to Atwood, and the amount of name dropping that happened was just over the top. So I kind of put her way on the back burner, way on the back burner. But I thought, okay, 30 years have passed. Why don't I give one of her early 1990s, late 1880s, I keep saying 1880s, I mean 1980s novels ago. So I picked up Cat's Eye, which came out in 88, and I thought this was actually a pretty good novel. It's well structured and it's well written. The points it's trying to make are clear and not particularly didactic. They've got lots of satire and Atwood's usual snark in it, which can be enjoyable. So it's the story of Elaine Risley, who's come from Vancouver to Toronto in the late 80s for a retrospective exhibit of her paintings. And the first-person narratives, one follows Elaine through her brief time in Toronto, about a week, and the other is Elaine remembering her childhood from about the age 9 to early adulthood, till she's 23-ish. And Atwood is using Elaine's memories as a way of working through how a particular kind of artist or painter was formed, what made Elaine the kind of artist she became. So interesting in that, and all the past elements all line up and make sense in terms of the art that she produces later in life. The two interesting things I would highlight about Cat's Eye. One is the very clear-eyed insistence Atwood has on describing and representing the kind of bullying that goes on amongst girls, girls are not always kind to each other, and the Cat's Eye is very good at representing the kind of bullying that can ultimately be genuinely life-threatening. She's very good at that. Moments of that I found kind of very uncomfortable to read. The other thing that Atwood is very good at in this particular novel is descriptions of material culture. So I'm a generation younger than Atwood is, but the material culture she's describing as being present in 1940s and 1950s Ontario was very much still part of Nova Scotia, the province I grew up in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, a little bit of a time warp thing. So things like she describes, like, the smell of dustbane in a school, the hideousness of having to wear gym costumes, gym bloomers. All of that continued in the Maritimes. Construction paper schools with very segregated school times, so girls' doors and boys' doors, the segregated nature of reading that was appropriate for girls, reading that was appropriate for boys, persisted here for a long time. So that felt very, very real, very present for me. So that she's very good at the descriptions of material culture. For that alone, I would recommend the novel. There's also a really good insight into Atwood's attitudes towards, especially early 1970s feminism. Elaine has a very uneasy relationship with it, and you'll see this repeated in lots of Atwood's work, I think. And that's quite well done, too. So I think that it's a well-done novel. I'm glad I read Cat's Eye, but I don't know that I'm going to pick up another Atwood anytime soon. But I would recommend it, especially if you like Atwood. A second novel I read that I thought was quite good is Anne Enright's The Green Road, which was published in 2015. I'm slowly working my way through Enright's novels. I think she's an under-talked-about novelist on BookTube. She's a very fine writer, very, very subtle. I mean, you can often miss that she's being quite funny and sharp if you're not paying the right kind of attention or you're not in the right kind of mood. So The Green Road traces 4 children and their mother from the late 80s, early 90s through to the mid-2000s. It traces 4 children and their mother, Rosaline. All of the characters are deeply flawed. All of the characters go through life-changing experiences, and they're all treated with clarity about where their limitations are and how those limitations change over time, and a kindness in the prose. So Enright isn't a cruel writer, I don't think, and some writers can be cruel. So Atwood, for example, can be quite a cruel writer when she's writing about characters. Enright isn't. She's often a much more subtle writer than Atwood is, and much kinder to her characters. So in The Green Road we have 4 children. Dan, who begins the novel by wanting to be a priest and then ends up in early 1990s New York, and you can imagine the kinds of things that happen there. Emmett, his elder brother, I think, or younger brother, who is a foreign aid worker who spends time in Mali and has struggles with his then girlfriend and her desire to have a street dog live in their home, and the problems that poses to their Muslim housekeeper. Dogs are problematic in Islamic cultures. And then there's a middle daughter, Constance. She's well named. She's quite a constant character who has become a mother and a homemaker who goes through a bout of medical difficulty. And there's a very funny scene of her doing the Christmas grocery shopping for everybody on Christmas Eve. I thought it was quite funny and quite a well done scene of the pleasure and the frustrations of doing a large grocery shop like that for a big family. And then there's the youngest daughter, Hannah, I think her name is, who is a new mother. She's got a very young child, has been working as an actress and has kind of come to the end of her career as an actress. she's basically aged out of most of the roles available to her, who's going through a very bad patch by the time we see her at the end of the novel. She's the character, I think, with the exception of Rosalind, who's in the worst way at the end of the novel. Costas is having some trouble too. And there's also Rosalind, who's the mother, who is, she's a piece of work in some ways. She's often quite unkind to her children in ways that don't always make sense to the reader. But she's also described with great care and kindness when the children are quite young and she's struggling with something that's going on in her life. Enright describes her as deploying the horizontal solution. The horizontal solution. Essentially, she takes to her bed for 3 or 4 days, and that's rendered with kindness and comedy that kind of behavior can provoke. The novel winds up with a Christmas meal in the childhood home that Rosalind is about to sell. And at one point, as all Christmas dinners in fiction go, disaster unfolds and Rosalind disappears. And there's, a search for her, and everything turns out fine in the end. I'm not doing a very good job of describing why I think the prose is very fine in this novel. I think it has to do with Enright's ability to construct small phrases that just encapsulate character, even side characters, so that the character she describes early in the novel, I can't even remember which character it is, that she describes them as having a clammy sanctity. Clammy sanctity. Doesn't that just tell you exactly what kind of a person you're dealing with? So The Green Road I would recommend as a really interesting, well-crafted, thoughtful novel that shows a group of people aging and going through all the things that aging gives you. Perspective, change, a chance to improve upon things you did in the past, and a slightly ambiguous ending that draws attention to, the need to pay attention as you're living. So that's the second novel that I read that I thought was quite good and is on my potentially to reread list. The third novel I read that I thought was quite fine, that I would be happy to reread or to recommend to somebody, even though I think it is a Marmite book, is Samantha Harvey's Orbital, which came out last fall of 2023. It's essentially a novella. It's very short, 120 pages roughly, and it recounts the day of 6 astronauts orbiting the Earth in a space station. And it's set, maybe 10 years in the future. And it's a very ordinary day, and the characters are all going through very routine and, for their context, very mundane activities. Ordinary housekeeping, routine experiments, routine note-taking. There's not a lot of plot. There's only very subtle character development. And if you're looking for swashbuckling and big plots, you're not going to find it in Orbital. Even though it's set on a day where there's a very significant event in one character's life, another character's got a little thing they're worrying about, and it's also the day that the spacecraft takes off from the Earth and it's about to land on the moon. So repeating the events of 1969. It's an odd little book in its way, and I call it Marmite because of that lack of very how would I describe it? Overwhelming plot or intense character development. It's a novel about repetition, about cyclical things, and so it uses a lot of repetition and cyclical plot structures or narrative structures. But I found the prose in this very beautiful, and the affection for the Earth as a planet and the places on the planet are very clear, and in places I found it very moving in ways I didn't expect for such a small book, small novel. So that's on my reread soon list to see if I can get closer to understanding why it worked for me when it doesn't clearly work for everybody, because it's, you know, not plot driven, not really character driven. It's kind of about a moment in time, and a moment in which if you look from a certain perspective, you can see how incredibly beautiful this planet is and how incredibly fragile it is, and how, you know, human life on this planet is on a knife edge right now. So BookTube, that's my reading wrap up for February. Not everything I read, but 3 books I found disappointing but interesting, and 3 books I found satisfying and interesting, and would recommend that you maybe have a poke through. That's all for me now. I hope you've had a good week, and I'll see you the next time. Bye-bye.